Good morning, AFSCME. Good morning. Put that over there. I'm glad to be here today. Let me first acknowledge President Lee Saunders. Would you give it up for him for his leadership? Your Secretary-Treasurer Reyes, my friend and colleague and brother and mentor on the national board of the NAACP, Bill Lucey, your former Secretary and Treasurer. And to my good friend, the Reverend Terry Melvin of CBTU. I want many of you to know that helping us to stir up a little trouble down in North Carolina is none other than Roz Pellis, who's a great blessing to all of us, and we thank God for her. I'm glad to be here today. In North Carolina, we're working together, believing in the possibility of America. And I bring you greetings from the North Carolina NAACP, President Saunders, the Forward Together Moral Movement down south, where we're fighting hard against a fresh expression of extremism, and where we are standing declaring that we will go forward together and not take one step back. 51 years ago, when I was born, this nation was in a moral crisis. There were governors whose lips were dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, denying the 14th Amendment, defying the 15th Amendment, and defying the Brown versus Board decision of '54. They were stuck, along with their immoral allies, in the attitudes of racism and classism, and had no shame, even as one declared, in the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. It was in that moment then that those who wanted to move forward were called outside agitators. During that time, violence accompanied this moral crisis. Medgar Evers was killed fighting for voting rights. Children were blown up in churches for simply wanting a free America. And even a president who was no raving liberal was killed in part because he was being moved to do the right thing, the moral thing. In this moment, the devotees of justice and freedom did not shrink back, no matter how hard it was. Unions and civil rights people came together. They did not have the money of the other side. They did not at first have the political votes. They did not have the majority of public opinion, but they did not shrink. They marched, they organized, they built coalitions, they rallied young people, they engaged in civil disobedience, they lobbied, they turned moments of despair into moments of hope. They came together. They lifted up the moral and religious principles of justice and love and fairness. My parents, two public educators, were a part of that generation that declared that they weren't going to let anybody turn them around. My father worked as a civil rights pastor, if you will. My mother and him helped integrate public schools. He worked to help workers get fair wages at the warehousing plant in Washington County. They understood that when you're fighting for justice, you've got to be able to stick it out. You got to stay with God's plan, understanding if you do that, you will have a day of completion. They declared that they were not quitters. They would not lose out. In fact, my father used to often quote a favorite scripture of Dr. King, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 39, which says, whenever you're facing trouble, we are not of those who shrink back unto destruction, but we are those who persevere unto the salvation of the soul. For faith is the substance of things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen. After the March on Washington, my parents chose to come back to the South to fight for equality in public education. I was born 2 days after the march, and the joke, President Saunders, and my family, I've often told Bill Lucy this, was that I was supposed to be born on the 28th. My mother went into labor. I saw all of you old folk marching. You're old now anyway. And I saw y'all marching. I went back and said, let me see what happens. And I was born on the 30th. 11 years after Brown, schools were still not desegregated. It'll be another 8 years. When my parents came back to the South, they didn't have protected voting rights. My father had 2 masters and a doctorate degree, but he didn't have protected voting rights. Voting rights was not passed until 1965, but they came back to fight for what was right. They joined the moral crusade to change the nation and the world. And they did change it. All of those immoral realities of racism and classism and the sin of injustice, despite that, there was a group of people that came together to change the world. You know, Dr. King, who spoke last with AFSCME, said some things in that period that we ought to hear again and again. To unions and civil rights, Dr. King said this word, together. Say that with me, together. He said, together we must exert massive pressure on the government to get jobs for all. Together we must form a grand alliance. Together we must merge all people of goodwill. And he said to unions and to civil rights, he said the 2 most dynamic movements in the nation have been the labor movement and the civil rights movement. He said our combined strength is enormous, but we have not used a fraction of it for our own good or for the needs of society of a whole. He said if we would come together and make the war on poverty a total war and the war against injustices and civil rights a total war, if we would unite our 2 movements, then 30 years from now, people would look back on this day and honor the fact that we came together and changed the world. I think he said that in 1961, but we need to hear it again in 2014. It was, and I like to read something besides just I Have a Dream speech of Dr. King. You know, he said something else besides that. I love that speech that he spoke to AFSCME on March 18, 1968, about 16 days before he would be killed. It's a tough one now. It's a tough speech because in that speech he spoke to 17,000 people from Memphis. AFSCME had organized it. Bill, you know about it. You were there. And in that speech, he began to sermonize, and he said, you know, Jesus reminded us in a magnificent parable one day that a man went to hell because he didn't see the poor. He didn't see workers. His name was Dives, and the other man was named Lazarus, who daily came to the gate seeking the basic necessities. Dives didn't do anything about it. Then Dr. King went on to say, there's nothing in that parable that says Dives went to hell because he was rich. Dives went to hell because he passed Lazarus by. Dives went to hell because he made poor people invisible. Dives went to hell because he allowed the means by which he lived to outdistance the ends for which he lived. That's Dr. King. He said Dives went to hell because he wanted to be a conscientious objector in the war against poverty and in the fight for labor rights. And then Dr. King said, so I come by here to say to America, you too will go to hell if you don't use your wealth to lift up all people. That's Dr. King. Dr. King said that if America does not use her vast resources of wealth to end poverty, to ensure labor rights, to make it possible for all of God's children to have the basic necessities of life, her economic systems will go to hell. He said, because there is something bigger than even our Constitution that one day we must answer. And it says this: when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was thirsty, did you give me drink? Then again, As he was about to leave us the night before he was murdered, and he was speaking to us again and again, AFSCME was right there. And Dr. King said, we're tired of walking up the street in search for jobs that do not exist. We're tired of working our hands off and laboring every day and not even making a wage adequate with the basic necessities of life. And so we come to say to Memphis, and we come to say, America, now is the time for things to change. And then he said that last night with us, he said, I want to say to you today, nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now. I believe that we need a recovery of that kind of moral clarity. I believe that deep within our being as a nation, as people are longing for a moral compass. For those of us who are moved by the cries of our sisters and brothers, we know that justice and caring for the vulnerable and embracing the stranger and healing the sick and protecting workers and welcoming and being fair to all members of the human family, regardless of their nationality or how they got here, and educating all our children should never be relegated to the margins of our social consciousness. Justice and fairness are not just policy issues. They are not left-right issues. They are the centerpiece of our deepest faith tradition, our deepest values, and our deepest moral calling. We must remind those who make decisions regarding public policy a truth that the prophet Isaiah said 2,600 years ago. Woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their right and make children and women their prey. We must say to the political structures what Otto Schwammer, an MIT professor, talked to us about in class. We must stop committing attention violence against the poor and against workers. There is a blind spot in our economic philosophy, and it's called the blind spot of consciousness. And the truth is, if you ignore the poor, and if you ignore working people, then one day the whole system will collapse and implode. When we don't deal with racism and poverty, it costs our soul as a nation. Every time we fail to educate a child, it costs us our soul as a nation. Every time we deny living wages and fight workers' rights and leave whole communities in poverty, it costs us the soul of our nation. Every time politicians who get health insurance because they got elected don't want the same people that elected them to have health insurance, it costs us the soul. The soul of our nation. And every time we attempt to suppress the right to vote, it tears at the very heart of our democracy. And I'm telling you, we have a moral crisis. When you have political extremists called by whatever name, Tea Party, ultra-conservative Coke money puppets, whatever name you want to call them, feeding the public with an immoral agenda. And you know, sometimes we just need to water it down and not be so complicated about what their agenda really is. Here it is. They say, those extremists, that the best way to have a better America is to deny public education, attack teachers and those who serve our children, deny health care and Medicaid expansion, leave millions of people uninsured, deny earned income tax credit for working people, deny unemployment, deny labor rights, deny LGBTQ rights, deny women's rights, deny immigrants' rights, hold vicious rally against little children who want to come to our shores, cut more taxes for the wealthy, and then declare you don't have money for critical investments, let the wealthy money go up, and refuse to raise minimum wage. And whenever you know your agenda can't survive in America if everybody votes, and you really want to make America great, the extremists say then engage in the worst form of voter suppression since Jim Crow. And then if you really want a great nation, this is what they're saying, if you really want a great nation, tell every lie you can about the president. Call him everything but an American and a child of God. Refuse to pass anything just because you don't like him. And then even fight his wife when she just wants children to eat healthy and have vegetables. It's a crazy agenda. And then after you flame all the fires of racial and class and national hatred and you get everybody mad, then make sure everybody can get a gun easier than they can vote. It is a ridiculous agenda. Touch your neighbor and say, that's immoral. It's a violation of our deepest values. It's a violation of the call to heal the sick and preach good news to the poor. It's a violation of the call to cry loud and spare not and tell the nation that just getting elected and putting your hand on the Bible when you swear yourself into office doesn't make you moral. Just having a lot of religious affairs doesn't make you moral. When you engage in public policy without a focus on justice, that is the ultimate hypocrisy and heresy as it relates to our deepest moral values. That's why God said in the Word of God, this is what God wants. Break the chains of injustice. Get rid of exploitation in the workplace. Free the oppressed. Cancel death and debts. And then if you do this, then the light of God will shine on you, and your nation shall be called a repairer of the breach. But not only is this extreme agenda contrary to our faith traditions, it's contrary to every promise of America. We promise that government of the people and by the people and for the people shall never fade from the face of the earth. We promise equal protection under the law. We promise we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created by equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We promise we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Those are the promises of our nation. We promise one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And anytime extremists set a course of attack against these values and these promises, we are in a moral crisis. And I want you to know, in America, we have this history. We go forward and fall backwards. In 1868 to be exact, right at the end of slavery, whites and blacks came together to push the nation forward morally. You know what their agenda was in 1868? I'm talking about white and black folk in the South. Public education as a constitutional right, fair wages, fair tax policy, health care, fair criminal justice system, and fair representation. Where I come from, 146 years ago, black and white people formed fusion politics together, and they changed the South. But you know it wasn't but a few years before the Tea Party, the extremists, I'm sorry. I'm in 1868, I'll get to 2000. It wasn't long before the radical racist Dixiecrats of that era, they could not stand this kind of coming together of people. So they began an immoral campaign of deconstruction. How did they do it? They used fear and division and political trickery. They came up with a phrase, we're going to take back America. They called it the redemption movement. And they said it was time to redeem America from the problem of black and white people working together to make things better. And so they took over the Supreme Court. Sound familiar? They rolled back voting rights. They attacked labor rights, 1800s now. They attacked public education, and they attacked any leader, black or white, that stood for progressive movement forward. And it ended with riots, 1898, and right here in Springfield, right here in Illinois in 1900. Then you get the second Reconstruction, 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education decision. America resets her moral compass. 9 white Supreme Justices, one a former Ku Klux Klan member, are met with the moral arguments of Thurgood Marshall and Jewish and black and white lawyers. They win. Fusion is born again. Blacks, whites, trade unions, Latinos, young people come together. You get the March on Washington. You get the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65. You get the war on poverty. You get changes to Social Security. You get the Office of Economic Equality. You get targeted economic development. You get people talking about community development banks. You get changes to Social Security. And once again, extremists couldn't stand this. And so they got together and they formed something called a white Southern strategy. They said, we'll use it in the South. We'll use it in suburbs in the North. We won't talk race straight out, but we'll talk against the things that have helped to bring people together. They used fear. They used division. They came against voting rights. They attacked the unions. They killed our leaders. And by 1968, the movement was at a lull. And they solidified their coming together in 1980 when Ronald Reagan started his presidential campaign in Mississippi, where Swanner, Cheney, and Goodman, Philadelphia, Mississippi, had been killed as a signal that we have locked down the South and locked up in America. In 1974, Charles Koch, way before we started paying attention, did a little speech, pulled people together. He said, listen, let's not invest in political candidates so much as we invest in infrastructure and mechanisms to feed our agenda 24/7. So the extremists decided to build a movement, and they began to build think tanks. They invested in groundwork. They invested at the state level. On the other hand, an article recently said progressive chose to let go of the moral movement. We almost stopped talking about moral movement, and we started investing in messiah candidates, political candidates alone to save us. But the problem is, as soon as the campaigns were over, the infrastructure was gone. But on the extremist side, they invested in infrastructure that would stay there, and the infrastructure pushed up candidates from the bottom up. And because of this, the extremists have built a movement, and they took the playbook from us. They got the playbook from Dr. King's 1963 speech, when he told us not to go back to Washington, but he said, go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to Georgia, and build a movement from the ground up. They changed the moral discussion in this country from justice and love to being limited to abortion, prayer in the schools, and homosexuality. Even though if you look even at the Bible I read out of, there are 2,000 scriptures in the Bible about love and justice and children and women, and only 5 scriptures in the Bible that speak to the issue of abortion, prayer in the schools, and homosexuality, and 4 of them they misinterpret. But somehow, and so this article says that the real issue is not that extremism is so strong, but that those who know we need a progressive moral agenda are unorganized, and we underestimate our power, and we have not come to realize that we have a moral message, as we dare take it to the street, that can preach to more than just the choir. And so I remember reading Dr. King told hundreds of delegates like this hall in 1961, he talked to them about his call on labor. He told labor, he said, listen, why don't we project a $2 million campaign to assist in grassroots organizing throughout the South? He said, why don't we ask every union member to tax themselves $1 to organize not just ourselves, but our community? And why don't we join together the movements of union and civil rights? Well, today, as I've done in other places, I humbly stand on Dr. King's shoulders to update his request. I want to say labor and civil rights are one. You can't have one without the other. We are all trade unionists. We are all civil rights activists. And it's time for all of us to get together and organize America like never before. Oh, yeah. Yes, I know these are tough times. The Supreme Court rolling back laws and becoming the enabler of those who want to buy our democracy. People treated like things, corporations treated like people, CEOs making 1,000 times more than the average worker. But would you turn to your neighbor and say, it's rough, but it's not worse than slavery, and we made it through that. Y'all hear what I'm saying? It's not worse than when women couldn't vote, but when Elizabeth Satan and Sojourner Truth got together, they won that. I mean, the Tea Party might be tough, but don't forget when Franklin Delano Roosevelt had polio, he raised minimum wage, he took on Republicans, he took on Democrats, he took on the Supreme Court, but when he brought people together, I mean, the Koch brothers got a little money, but it ain't worse than apartheid. And didn't Nelson Mandela teach us that when we come together, oh Lord, they didn't show you the other video today, but I'm come here to tell you that I know it works. And down in North Carolina, not for the last year, that's where people get it wrong, but for the last 8 years. But Lucy was there when we first started and nobody was paying any attention. We have begun to build an indigenously led, state-based, state government focused, deeply moral, deeply constitutional, anti-racist, anti-poverty, pro-justice, pro-labor, transformative fusion movement, and it works. It works. When you build a movement from your state up with leaders in your state, I stopped by to tell you, nobody's going to come from D.C. and save you, and nobody's going to get up from the grave and save us. Martin is dead. Fannie Lou Hamer is dead, but we are their children, and we are yet alive. Time to organize. Tell your neighbor it's time to organize, state by state. I want us to find a way to put aside our differences and organize. We need to organize a fund to fund labor and civil rights organizers, particularly in the South. President Saunders, I'm asking you to call on AFL-CIO. Join with us. Let's build the movement that our leaders envision. Let's not allow the Koch brothers and the Tea Party to take the dream of our prophet and use it against ourselves. Oh, and I'm here to tell you as I move to my seat, down in North Carolina, we've seen greedy, wealth extremists play on the fears of working class white people. We've seen them pushing a moral agenda. We've seen ultra-extremist conservative politicians and their financial backers use a divide and conquer strategy. But in the midst of it all, we've also seen the power of building a transformative fusion movement. We've seen the power of building an understanding of the intersectionality between the issues of all of our partners. We've seen the power of refusing to be depressed, but standing up and fighting. So we've got 5 areas that have drawn 200 organizations together, including union. And we believe if folk can't get with these 5 agendas, then there's something just wrong with them. Because I'm tired of going into another meeting to decide what the agenda is. Hell, by now, we ought to know what the agenda is. We ought to fight for the agenda. And so, we declare that pro-labor, anti-poverty policies that create economic sustainability is an agenda, a moral agenda. That educational equality, by ensuring every child receives a high-quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education, is a moral agenda. That health care for all, assuring access to Affordable Care Act and Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and providing environmental protection is a moral agenda. That fairness in the criminal justice system by addressing the continuing inequalities in the system for poor folk and black folk and brown folk is a moral agenda. And protecting and expanding voting rights and women's rights and LGBT rights and labor rights and immigrants' rights and equal protection under the law is a moral agenda. And all of these agendas intersect. Because the same people fighting labor rights are fighting civil rights. The same people fighting LGBT rights are fighting health care rights. The same people fighting health care rights are fighting educational rights. The same people fighting educational rights are fighting criminal justice rights. So if they are together, by God, we ought to get together and fight them back. Well, you say, preacher man, what's happened? Well, today I want to ask you not just to walk by faith, but you can also walk by a little sight. We've now been at this Forward Together Moral Monday for 64 straight weeks. And if you include the 7 years before, that's 7 years, 8 years, and 8 years and 12 weeks. We've had, since last April, 120 actions. That's 10 every month. Because we found out that extremists don't care nothing about you having one rally. They'll sit right in the window, have a picnic, drink wine and juice, watch you have your rally, watch you leave, watch you go back home, and still vote against you. So we've got to have a movement and not just a moment. We've been building, we've seen 1,000 people get arrested in the State House for civil disobedience, more than any time in the history of the nation. We've seen over 1,000 clergy now come together. We've seen labor and civil rights and women and immigrant rights and environmentalists work together like never before. We've seen voting rights advocates stand up for women's rights and women's rights advocates stand up for education. We've seen LGBT people fighting for LGBT rights come and stand up for economic justice and labor rights. We now have 50 young people organizing in 50 counties to register 50,000 new voters in 10 weeks. In February, we had more than 80,000 people to show up one day in the middle of the winter. Oh, we've seen what happens. We've made a state movement a national issue. We are now organizing not just at the NAACP convention, but we now have organizing in Mitchell County. You say, where is Mitchell County? Well, Mitchell County is 99% white and 89% Republican. And they sent for me, I didn't send for them. Y'all didn't hear what I said. Now, when they first sent for me and said, come to Mitchell County, I said, you got to be out your mind. I said, I'm not going up there. All the black folk were ran out in 1920. I said, if they're going to shoot me, I'm not going to stand right in front of the gun. But then one of the ministers, who's an elder, said, Barber, you got to go up there because a moral agenda is not liberal, it's not conservative, it's not Democrat, it's not Republican, it's about what's right. And you got to believe that there's still something inside of people that will hear what's right. So we went up there. The morning I got ready to go, I told Brother Terry, I kissed my wife like I never kissed her before because I wasn't sure. I preached like I was never going to come back to the pulpit. Went up the mountain, one road in, got there. All white people, conservatives were in the building. When I went in there, they said, we're not here to talk about Republican, we're here to talk about what's right. Do you know the scripture about when Jesus overturned the tables in the temple? I said, oh yeah. I said, if I'm not mistaken, that happened on a Monday, so that was the first moral Monday. So Brother Lee, I started talking to them about how extremist politics that cut labor rights and cut unemployment hurt everybody, and how denying public education hurts everybody, and how denying minimum wages hurt everybody. I started talking to them about how I believe in tax cuts, but they ought to be targeted tax cuts to poor communities to get industry to invest in those poor communities. And then if you get a tax cut, you ought to pay a living wage. At about 9 o'clock, they said, Reverend Barber, let me tell you why we called you up here. They said, we are Republicans, but we're not extremists. We're like Eisenhower Republicans that believe that education is a matter of national security. We're like Roosevelt Republicans that believe the four moral issues are labor and environment and education and voting rights. They said, we invited you up here to let you know something. We've been having our own moral Mondays. We just wanted to make sure that y'all were not just a pawn of any party, but you were serious about coming together. So we come here to tell you tonight that the chair of the Republican Party has renounced the party and the current extremist takeover. They said, we want you to know that we called you here because we got a question for you. I said, what is? They said, can we form an NAACP branch in Mitchell County? I said, what you say? They said, now it won't be a black branch. It'll be like the early branches of the NAACP in 1900, but it'll be a radical branch. It'll be a fighting branch. And now, not only do we have a branch there, but in 3 counties around there where we've never had an NAACP branch. And they are pro-civil rights and pro-labor rights. I'm almost through. I'm telling you, this coming together work. And then at about 9:30 that night, they said, we got one more request. I said, what's that? They said, will you lead us on a march to the Tea Party legislator's house? I said, wait a minute, white peoples. I said, I'm all about this fusion, but y'all started that mess about marching at night. Black folk don't march at night now. Help me a little bit, sound man. My voice is a little weak. But they said, well, what about tomorrow? I said, in Asheville, we'll be there tomorrow in the daytime. And 10,000 people showed up in Asheville, North Carolina the next day. Coming together with a moral message and a moral movement. It works. The governor, when we started, called us crazy, outsider. So one of the people in his party called us morons. But guess what? When we started, he was at 50%. Now he's at 30% in the polls and falling. The legislature, when we started, was at 40%. Now they're at 17% in the polls and falling. When we started this movement, they said we were just another arm of the Democratic Party. But the more we talked about a moral message, the more it caught on. And now 55% of North Carolinians oppose cutting unemployment. 55% of North Carolinians are for raising the minimum wage. 61% of North Carolinians are against giving public funds to private schools. In the South, 73% of voters are for outlawing discrimination against gays in hiring and firing. 55% of voters now will accept raising taxes if you're going to use it to build up education. And 68% of North Carolina voters now are against cuts to early voting and against cuts to straight ticket voting, and they are in favor of something better than this suppressive voter ID. I'm telling you, it works. And so I've come by to tell you, not from what I've heard, but from what I've seen. It's time to say to America, we will not turn back now. When anybody, no matter how much spiked Tea Party tea they have drank, tries to take us backwards, when anybody, no matter how much lewd and pornographic sums of Koch brother monies they have taken, when anybody, no matter who they are, and no matter how many voting roadblocks they put up, or how many judges they buy and place on the court, it's time to tell America we will organize together, we will fight together, we will pray together, we will mobilize together, we will raise our voices together, we will fight for our children together, we will demand a living wage together, we will heal the sick together, we will organize together, we will turn our lawyers loose in the courtroom together. Together. And so, I want to ask one thing of AFSCME, Mr. President. On August the 21st through the 28th, the 51st anniversary of the March on Washington, I'm asking you to follow what we're going to do. I can't tell other states, but we're saying, why keep going back to D.C. having commemoration of the March on Washington when Martin told us not to do it? The only time Martin said go back to D.C. is if you're going to stay there until that check mark insufficient funds is finally cashed. So from the 21st to the 28th, in North Carolina, we're calling for 7 days of straight marching and action and voter registration on our capital, where Tillis, Berger, and McCrory, the leaders of extremists, hold. And I wonder what would happen, Mr. President. I wonder what would happen, Brother Lucy, if all of us would do this. If particularly the southern states, what would happen if we could be unified for 7 days? What would happen if for 7 days we marched on state capitals, focused on that agenda for workers' rights and health care and education and voting rights and equal protection? What would happen? And what would happen if on the 7th day we marched around 7 times and then we went inside the Capitol and sat down and engaged in civil disobedience? Oh, my friends, I believe we could change the dialogue in this country. I believe we could shift the center of political gravity. I believe they'd have to report it on CNN, MSNBC, and even despite us, Fox News. I believe we could inspire people to come together. And I know the power of coming together. I know it biblically. Can I be a preacher for 5 minutes? Yeah, Lord. I know the power of coming together. Because when Moses and his people and his rod and his God came together, then the sea opened and Pharaoh was brought down. When Esther and her uncle Mordecai came together, they were able to stop the plots of destruction against their people. When David and his rock and his slingshot and his faith got together, he was able to bring down Goliath on a battlefield. And the paper read the next morning, the bigger they come, the harder they fall. When Shadrach, Meshach, and that bad Negro stayed together, even in a fiery furnace, when it was all over, they came out all right. When the disciples got together in an upper room and the Holy Spirit came upon them, they had power. I said power. I said power. Oh my God. I know it biblically, but I also know it historically. When Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe got together, they brought slavery down. When women like Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Canton got together, they made America give women the right to vote. When black and Jewish and white lawyers got together, they overturned the Supreme Court. When Dr. King and civil rights leaders and union leaders and people of all classes got together and marched across the Edmunds Pettus Bridge, they changed the voting rights in this country. Don't you know they are afraid of us getting together? All these attacks on our voting rights is because they know what will happen if we get together. If they have to use the Supreme Court to stop us, if they've got to spend all this money to stop us, if they've got to do all that to stop us, we must be some bad somebodies when we get together. Well, hallelujah. I'm on my way. I'm on my way to yonder seat. But I not only know it biblically about getting together, I not only know it historically about getting together, I know it personally. Because in 1993, a disease hit my body. And doctors said I might not ever walk again. And for 12 long years, I was on a walker and in a wheelchair. But during that period of time, something happened. My body got together, and my mind got together, and my doctors got together, and my therapists got together, and my prayer warriors got together, and my faith got together, and my swim coach got together. And when they all got together, when they all got together, what a day, what a day, what a day. I stopped by here to tell you, when we all get together, when the union and civil rights, when we all get together, what a day, what a day, what a day, what a day, what a day. Keep your eyes on the prize. Somebody